Good evening. Good evening, everybody. We've just given it a moment for everybody to join in. So good evening and welcome to Industrial Fish Farms in the Gulf. What's next? I'm Christian Wagley, and I'm the Florida and Alabama coastal organizer for Healthy Gulf, based here in Pensacola, Florida. And I've got some great guests joining us this evening to update you all on what's happening with the battle around industrial scale aquaculture and the attempts to bring that into the Gulf of Mexico, where we're really here on the front lines of that issue. So a little bit about Healthy Gulf. We've been around for 30 years now. We're based in New Orleans, but we're actually founded in Florida. And we have a staff of about 15 that works from Florida to Texas. So we work in all five Gulf states. And the aquaculture issue is one that's we've been working on for probably the last 4 or 5 years, or maybe a bit longer. But we've always been interested, certainly, in the issues of sustainable seafood and sustainable management of our fisheries in the Gulf of Mexico. So joining us this evening are Dana Honn, who's a chef and restaurateur in New Orleans, who's going to give the chef's perspective after I give a little bit of an update on what's happening in the Gulf region. And then we'll go to James Mitchell, who's the legislative director for Don't Cage Our Oceans, which is a national coalition that Healthy Gulf is part of. So we'd love to have your questions, but we would just ask you to type those into the chat, and we'll be monitoring that, and we'll be sure to get those asked of our guests at the very end. So we should be here for no more than an hour, or maybe a little bit less than that, depending on how things go and in respect of your time. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and see about sharing my screen here so that I can share a few slides and kind of give a little bit of the Gulf perspective on where we are with industrial agriculture here. So let's see. How are we looking there? Got it? All right. Well, again, everybody, Christian Wagley, I'm the coastal organizer for Florida and Alabama with Healthy Gulf. And we are a member in coalition with Don't Cage Our Oceans, which has about 60 members and growing around the country. These are commercial fishermen and fisher folk and nonprofit organizations and community groups, and really a wide range of organizations that really care about where our seafood comes from, how it's produced, the story behind it, and have a lot of concerns, or really have been working against this industrialization of our oceans, our shared resources for industrial scale aquaculture. So you see some of the groups that are involved. We have some on the Gulf Coast in addition to Healthy Gulf, and really well represented around the Atlantic and Pacific coast as well. So a little bit of introduction to what we're talking about here tonight. I mean, we're all pretty familiar with, going to a restaurant or a seafood market where, we've been very used to seafood. You kind of, I guess, in the old days, maybe having come from a fisher person in our community, who harvested the fish in a nearby bay or river or lake. But increasingly, much of the world's seafood is coming from aquaculture, and some of that happens on land in ponds, but more and more of it is happening out in the ocean, out at sea, is in these large floating cage systems. And it's not something that we have yet on in U.S. waters, U.S. federal waters off the continental United States, but the Gulf of Mexico, where many of us live here, is really on the front lines of the battle around that, because we would see it here first if it does happen. So that's a little bit about what those systems kind of look like. You certainly don't have to be an expert in aquaculture or to dig very deep to know that these systems and this system of aquaculture really has had problems. If you're just a general consumer of the news like I am, you see these articles from all over the world talking about many, many issues with industrial scale fish farms in our open waters. These are, fish escaping and interbreeding with native wild fish, or transferring disease to native wild fish. Also, pollution issues from the fish farm waste and excess feed and such. So, and some of this has led to legal action. Some of this has led to states and nations either dialing back or entirely removing themselves from being part of this and allowing this in their waters. So it's really something that's been very controversial, especially, really over the last 10 or 15 years or so. And I think if you're just following the news at all, you're probably seeing stories about this, especially in Europe, Scotland, Canada, places like that. But the really, important thing to know is that this type of industrial scale fish farming is really another form of confined animal feeding operation. We all maybe we haven't visited in person, but we're familiar somewhat with the inhumane conditions and the horrors that can happen with industrial agriculture in America, in a combined animal feeding operation that could be chickens or hogs or cattle that are confined in very small spaces, really live in pretty unsanitary and inhumane conditions, and obviously nothing like these animals would live on their own or in the wild or if left on their own. And it's the same thing with fish. When we cage these fish up offshore, they're not able to move around and forage naturally. These are fish that would normally move over potentially hundreds or even thousands of square miles of open water, and instead they're confined in one particular place, which creates its own set of issues in terms of how the animals are cared for, the disease that can come from that type of crowding, and then again the impacts on the adjacent waters and the ecosystem surrounding it. So San Diego Coastkeeper, where they faced some issues with this on the West Coast and in California, did a really nice graphic kind of outlining some of the different issues that have been common to this type of industrial aquaculture. And so you see some of the things that I've mentioned already with disease and even things like predator control that can potentially harm birds or other marine life and trying to exclude them from the cages, the use of antibiotics and other types of pharmaceuticals and what that might do to wild fish as well. So really a range of issues, even beyond just the obvious ones of the waste from the fish and all the excess feed creating pollution from nutrients that can cause algal blooms, which we'll talk about. Responsible aquaculture really looks more like this, and that's the growing of things like seaweed, which they call mariculture, or shellfish. And I know where I live here in Northwest Florida in Pensacola, oyster farming is still fairly new to us. A lot of other parts of the country have had clam and scallop and even oyster farming for a much longer period of time than we have. So if you live along the coast, most anywhere in the United States, you probably have some type of shellfish farming going on near you. And this can be done in the most beautiful ways because shellfish farming actually purifies the water and actually makes it cleaner. And you don't have to bring in food to actually feed these animals. One of the things that happens with finfish farming is you have to go kill a bunch of little fish and create feed from that in order to feed these bigger fish. And there's a loss of energy along the way and additional pollution from that versus these shellfish that can just be done in such wonderful ways in coastal waters. And we're just seeing more and more of that all around our coast, which is really, really exciting to see. The seaweed, mariculture, not so much on the Gulf Coast here, but certainly up on the West Coast and up in the Northeast as well, we see. A little bit about some of the background on what's brought us to the point where we are now in facing a more immediate threat of industrial scale aquaculture in the Gulf of Mexico. And that's an executive order from President Trump back in 2020 that kind of got the agencies moving toward things like the aquaculture opportunity areas, which we're going to talk about in just a moment. And then one of the things that our Don't Cage Our Oceans Coalition did a couple of years ago was a letter with, and I forget, I think it was over 100 signers on that, asking President Biden to revoke that executive order, which he did not do. And so that process of the federal government moving toward this offshore aquaculture in the Gulf of Mexico has continued. And of course, James is here, and a little bit later on, he's going to update on what's going on in Washington, and we'll be able to touch on some of these issues and update us on these. So I'm going to start out with the proposed fish farm that's the farthest along, and that is one by a company called Ocean Era, located, proposed to be located about 45 miles offshore from Sarasota, Florida. And we've had incredible opposition to that. It's been going on for a number of years, public hearings and all through the permitting process. I know we have some folks from that area on the call this evening. It's always good to see you all. The folks in that Sarasota, Tampa area there have been very, very strongly opposed. This would be it's considered to be an experimental fish farm. It's a little bit smaller than some of the others, and it would just function for 1 year, raising red drum. It has been litigated and held up somewhat through that process, but EPA proposed last fall to issue the final Clean Water Act permits for that facility. There was a public comment period on that we participated in, and we could potentially see some news on a permit for that almost any time now. So that is quite close to happening, or at least from the permitting standpoint. This is just showing kind of where that is, 45 miles kind of west-southwest of Sarasota. And I'm going to use just this one as an example of some of the issues that are actually fairly common to this type of industrial scale fish farm aquaculture anywhere. One is the type of nutrient pollution that can come from these facilities. This is a lot of what we hear about in salmon farming, but it's also something, what are called harmful algal blooms, of which red tide is an example. We know, those of us in Florida, especially if you live in Southwest Florida, are very familiar with red tides. They have occurred naturally over many, many centuries, but the science is clear now, just in the last few years, that these types of red tides, and this is an algal bloom that, if anybody's been around it, you go to the beach and you can see dead fish. You have respiratory irritation of your eyes and mucous membranes. We've had some terrible outbreaks in the last 10 years that have shut beaches down for months and led to hundreds of millions of dollars of economic losses in these areas, from Naples up to the Tampa-St. Pete area. But we know that these red tide events, while they can and do occur naturally, the science says that they can be made worse. So they can be made more intense, and they can be made to last longer because of nutrients from human activities. And so the farm that's proposed off of Sarasota is actually proposed to be located right in the area offshore where these red tide events start. And it's a complex set of conditions that create these red tide events, interactions between nutrients and the organisms themselves and such, and temperature conditions and all of that. But we haven't seen anything yet that satisfies us to think that adding more nutrients to these offshore areas, which a fish farm is certainly going to do, couldn't potentially make these red tide events worse. And the people in this area suffer tremendously already. So anything that would make that worse, potentially make that worse, we would certainly be opposed to and are very concerned about that. The species, like I mentioned, was red drum, which is one that's, or redfish, we typically call it here in the South. That's what's being proposed to be raised. They originally started with Almaco jack, and then they changed up and are proposing to grow redfish. And of course, a lot of people would say, well, it's a native fish, but it is a native fish. But one of the things we know now, and the science is very clear on, is that fish that come out of hatcheries, that are raised in a hatchery and then put in these offshore aquaculture systems, are genetically quite distinct from the wild fish. And so when they escape and interbreed with the wild fish, the hatchery fish actually reproduce at a lower rate, so they can actually have the effect of reducing the ability of that wild stock of fish to reproduce, in addition to potentially transferring disease to them. So that's another thing that's problematic. One of the other things we're monitoring is any impacts of potential offshore aquaculture in the Gulf on marine mammals. There is research showing that these offshore systems can interfere with either by entangling marine mammals like dolphins or whales, or interfere with their ability to forage. These facilities may attract them, they may discourage them. It just interferes in various ways with their natural foraging, which is always a problem when we interfere with the natural ways of these animals. And so the Rice's whale is one that's in the news quite a bit. At least so far, it appears that the fish farms that have been proposed in the Gulf are inshore, so closer to shore and out of the main habitat areas for the Rice's whales, which you see there on the left. But certainly these are areas that are certainly visited by bottlenose dolphins and a number of other marine mammals. I think there's probably about 8 species of whales in the Gulf, some of which, or many of which, do come closer to shore than the Rice's whales do. So that's a little bit about the farm proposed off Sarasota that's farthest along, but I want to pivot just real quickly to a farm that's proposed for off Pensacola Beach, where I live, and that's Manna Farms, which is based in Long Island, New York. And so we asked the question, who is Manna? Because it's a little bit interesting. Manna is indeed based in Long Island, but they don't have any existing farms out there. They've proposed one for off of Long Island and another one off of Pensacola Beach, but because they don't have any existing farms, it's a little hard to judge. They don't have a record to go by. Are they responsible operators? Are they really serious about this? What's their thing? So, but I can show you a little bit about where they're proposing to go off of Pensacola. You see Pensacola to the north there, and if you go kind of due south and a little bit to the east, you see that red mark there, and that's the area about 23 miles offshore that they have asked for, applied for permits in that area. A little bit about the system, kind of what the cage system looks like. Again, moored to the bottom as the others are, and a little bit about the depth. And now this is a much larger production type facility. Remember the one off Sarasota proposed was a smaller demonstration project. This is a much larger production facility with potentially millions of pounds of fish per year. And they had hoped when they applied for permits to be built out by 2029, but they're still in the permitting, which I'm going to talk about in a moment and give a little update on that. But I wanted to share one little unique thing that relates to this farm, the proposed Manna farm, and then the others in the Eastern Gulf, is that we have a big test range in the Eastern Gulf for the military. It's part of it's one of the things that kind of helps keep offshore drilling away. It also may be something ultimately that limits the ability of offshore aquaculture to locate in the Eastern Gulf of Mexico, because this area is considered an irreplaceable resource by the military. They do a ton of testing and training, and they blow things up and fly missions and do all kinds of things out there. And anything that gets in the way of that, oil and gas rigs or floating fish farms, they have tended to oppose. So that's a little bit of a twist on the Eastern Gulf anyway. This Manna farm off Pensacola Beach, we did do a group letter. A number of businesses signed on to that a couple of years ago, expressing concern and opposition to that, and that was sent to Representative Gates and then Senators Rubio and Scott at the time. There's been some pretty good opposition from some of the community groups along the beaches here. And a little bit about the permitting that was submitted really a few years ago at this point. And every time I've checked in with to get updates from the federal government on that, it's just continuing to go along within the internal deliberations of the agencies. And so I don't have any particular update other than before any permitting would be done, there would be public hearings on that, and we would all have the chance to be able to get more involved in this issue and ask a lot more questions, and as part of the normal environmental review process the federal government does. One of the great things about living in this nation, right, is we have these incredible environmental laws that hopefully will persist through some of what's going on in Washington right now. But it does mean things move slowly. And the good part of that is that it's part of making sure that things get done right. And it gives the citizens, it gives nonprofit groups like ours, the ability to challenge things both formally and informally and be involved in the process. So thankfully, we still have that here in the United States, and we need to make sure that we continue to have that. So I'm just going to wrap up before we go to Dana by just making you all aware of the most immediate thing happening in the Gulf of Mexico right now, and that is what's called aquaculture opportunity areas that the federal government proposed. They are an outgrowth of the Trump executive order that I showed earlier. And so these are areas that have been identified in the Gulf of Mexico, and they've also done it off Southern California as well, where they've tried to go out and look offshore at environmental spaces in the Gulf, what types of bottoms there are, what kinds of marine organisms and wildlife use different areas. They've looked at different user groups. Where are the fishermen? Where is the military? What is happening out in the Gulf of Mexico, so that they can create some designated areas that potentially, if aquaculture were placed in these areas, it would avoid these conflicts. It would avoid more serious environmental issues, conflicts with other user groups, conflicts with sensitive species or sensitive ecosystems and such. And so that is out for public comment right now through February 20, and we're going to we're going to drop in the chat an action alert that Healthy Golf has ready, where folks who would like to can weigh in and add their comments on this. We continue to be Healthy Golf and Don't Cage Our Oceans opposed to the creation of these aquaculture opportunity areas in the Gulf, because we have not seen yet where the concerns like those that I've raised this evening have been satisfied. When we know that there are better alternatives, both through wild seafood and this types of sustainable methods for producing aquaculture, whether it's shellfish or mariculture or even finfish. So we don't believe that this is right for the Gulf and that we need to go into this. But I will say that there was a public comment period and public scoping that went on a couple of years ago when this was first proposed, and it was really quite dramatic, the amount of opposition from people largely in the Gulf region to creating these aquaculture opportunity areas. I mean, the Gulf is really especially around Louisiana, is really the richest, the richest fishery off the continental United States anyway. And a lot of us that live here, we know about our local seafood. We know where it comes from. We value the wild seafood. And it seems like that may be a factor in people understanding that this is a type of thing that they don't want to see come to the Gulf. The Gulf is also fairly unique because we've suffered under the oil and gas industry for so long in the Central and Western Gulf and all of the impacts from that. But the aquaculture opportunity areas, again, are up for public comment until February 20, and we'd love for all of you to take action on that and make comments. We'll drop that in the chat, and then I'll follow up later on with an email to those here tonight and those who couldn't attend with a link to that action alert if you want to get involved in that. So with that, and again, we will take questions at the end. I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to try to stop it here. And we're going to pivot to Dana. Are you there, Dana?
Yes, I'm there.
There we go. Did that screen share stop? My system's a little slow here.
Yeah, you're good.
Gotcha. All right. Well, so Dana, I'll introduce him as best I can, and he can add on to that. But Healthy Golf is based in New Orleans, and so I get to go over there and enjoy New Orleans quarterly or so, and have been able to go out to eat at one of Dana's restaurants, Cafe Carmo, and it's a great experience because it is very much about local seafood and sustainable seafood, and very much part of the New Orleans food scene. And Dana's been involved in so much of that movement, and so we just asked him to kind of give the chef's perspective this evening about the threat of offshore fish farms and what sustainable seafood means to him. So take it away, Dana.
All right, thank you, Christian. Yeah, I appreciate the opportunity for sharing my story, I guess. I was thinking about what exactly these offshore industrial fish farms would mean to kind of the way of life that has existed in Louisiana for a long, long time, and it brought up some interesting questions in my mind about what is value, what is of value in our relationships that we build with our fish. I personally, as a chef, I consider my primary job to be building relationships with fishers, with producers, with my customers, with my staff. Part of that involves education. Part of it involves, introduction to new things. There are a lot of different facets that over the years, Carmo, actually, we just recently closed Carmo in the warehouse district, and a few weeks ago opened a new restaurant in another part of town, and it's a new adventure. I think that a lot of the relationships that we built through Carmo over the 15 years we were there, those relationships are allowing us to do what we're doing now. They allow us to move forward in new ways and hopefully discover new things in terms of what's possible in, doing business as a retail seafood seller. And so I guess what I'd like to do is just comment a few things about my experience over these 15 years of building these relationships, and some maybe a couple of anecdotes that express that. One of the things that from the very beginning, we opened Carmo. Uh, Actually, I guess officially, we got our occupational license on April 4th, 2010. I don't know if that date means anything to anybody, but it corresponds with BP. I was actually we ended up opening over the next few weeks as we had to get our permanent permit, etc. But I was actually out on the Gulf about a mile and a half from the platform as it sunk, because a buddy of mine and I had a tuna trip that had been planned months ahead of time. And he was like, "Shout, do you think we should go out? Do you think we should?" I was like, "Well, if they need help with anything, they will direct us. And if not, we'll get the hell out of there." And we went out, there was nobody around. We didn't see any other boats, but we saw stuff floating in the water, uh, including uh, including life preservers. So we were picking through those, making sure there was nothing attached. We were, of course, breathing in the fumes, because that happened to be the day that the actual rig sank. So we saw it descend into the water with you know giant flames, etc. So it was a dramatic experience, and of course, by the time I got back, that was pretty much the end of the opening menu that we had written, because it was very seafood heavy, and it was very much based around our Gulf seafood. And the idea of Karma was food with a story, being able to, uh, of course, get hopefully good things to eat, and but sourcing things that if you source correctly and you're sourcing the best, there's a lot that you don't have to worry about. It's my job basically not to mess it up. If I source a great piece of fish, then I don't want to mess it up. So uh, that kind of philosophy really grew at Carmo, and the great chefs who came in over the years to be our partners, and the relationships that we built with our fishers just strengthened, and our farmer producers. And over that time, one thing that became really apparent was that there's a lot more to this than just sourcing fish. There's a lot more to it than just the act of fishing and the act of distributing and purchasing and processing, etc. There's there are lives behind this, and there's history behind it, and all of this together makes culture. And this culture that is made is so quintessentially important to Louisiana that people don't even know how to articulate it. It's hard to imagine what happens. It's hard to describe what kind of deep communication and relationships develop at a seafood boil in New Orleans. It's hard to, I mean, you can talk about the fun. Oh yeah, we went there, we did this, and so played, and there was a second line, and blah, blah, blah. All of these things are true, but what's happening is a lot deeper culturally. And sometimes it's hard to key in on that and describe to people that that is a thing. And so when I was thinking about this whole thing, I mean, I'm not a scientist. I know the effects the negative effects from industrial fish farms, wherever they are, no matter how far offshore they are. I know what those are, and I know how those will physically impact our wild fisheries. And we can talk about, but I'm not a specialist in that. I would rather leave that to James and Christian and others who actually have a deeper understanding of that. But what I can tell you is we by changing our focus from supporting our wild fishers and fisheries, we not only do a disservice to them, but we risk losing the relationships that are so fragile and take so long to build. And when those begin to break down, we lose everything. That is the collapse of our fisheries. That is the collapse of our culture. And you know, the other day, actually, I guess it was yesterday, I had an experience with about 45 young chefs that, you know, I get called in sometimes to a couple of our local schools to do this is how you clean a whole fish kind of classes, or whole fish utilization, and talk about sustainability, etc. And these were very young chefs, like young enough that I was really worried about them breaking down whole fish because their knife skills weren't quite there yet. And so I had to take it very, very much piecemeal in terms of this is the fish. And because I was really taking my time with it, it gave me time to also talk about what this thing was. It happened to be black drum, one of our great wild, you know, fish from our estuaries. And you know, as I was talking about that, you know, I mentioned to this group of young people, I said, you know, these were your ancestors who were doing this. They did this, and it had been done before them. And it is important what we're doing by handling this wild fish, and by learning how to break it down and how to use the whole thing, because that's what they did. And the reason that we're sitting here and have what we call New Orleans culture is because of that, at least in part. And so I really think there's a stark contrast, and it's not that, you know, industrial fish farms are going to completely negate New Orleans culture. It's not that, but I can draw the analogy to what's happened in our shrimp fishery, which is it takes, again, the focus off what's important. What's important is supporting our wild fishers, and making sure that their professions and their livelihoods and their coastal communities are held up and supported and have longevity. So I guess that to me really it, again, it's a stark contrast on how am I doing on time? I guess that's about really all I wanted to say. You know, I mean, I'd be happy to take questions later. But
Dana,
thank you so much.
that's fantastic. Just that food culture connection, just so beautiful how you describe that. And I can't wait to eat at your new restaurant when I get over there. And for those he didn't talk about it tonight, but Dana's also been he just held a very successful shrimp festival over in New Orleans last fall. And some of you may have seen in the news where they've been going around and testing the shrimp at at a lot of shrimp festivals, and it's all been imported. But Dana's was they tested there, and it was all local fresh shrimp from the Gulf. So not surprising. So thank you for that, Dana. So we will get toward wrapping up here with James Mitchell. James is the legislative director for Don't Cage Our Oceans. And again, Don't Cage Our Oceans is a coalition working to stop offshore fish farming in U.S. waters while uplifting values-based seafood led by local communities. And I've gotten to know James through our work over the last few years, and he always helps me know what's going on in Washington. And I understand there's a lot going on up there now, but what would you like to update us on, James?
Yeah, Christian, thank you so much, and thank you, Dana, as well. So as you mentioned, you know, we have about 60 members. About 10 of them are headquartered in cities along the Gulf of Mexico. And our strength comes from our partners, such as Healthy Gulf and chefs like Dana. And what we stand for, Christian covered it. We're opposed to finfish style farming in the ocean. We do support other values-based forms of either, family fishing communities or doing aquaculture the right way, values-based aquaculture. That's namely bivalve seaweed farming in the ocean, again, according to state law. And so, yeah, we're here to say no to something and yes to something else. And that actually brings me to what we actually accomplished last congressional session, last year. We succeeded in getting an important piece of legislation introduced. It was called the Domestic Seafood Production Act. We call it DISPA for short. And that was an exciting piece of legislation because it reminded NOAA, here the agency that's trying to permit and regulate fish farms, saying, look, remember you all lost a lawsuit in 2020. You don't have any authority to regulate aquaculture in federal waters. You would need an act of Congress to do such a thing. And it also, while it said no to that, it also said yes to providing resources from the federal government to demonstrated portside communities that are in need, and like a desired need and a desired want, I guess you could say, for that money to come into their communities for processing support. So I think a lot of you, particularly those of you in the fishing community, are familiar with fewer and fewer options for processing once you bring your catch in. Also, we've been seeing a lot of, outsourcing of processing overseas. And so DISPA would help reshore a lot of those processing jobs, keeping the seafood local and not adding to this so-called seafood trade deficit by simply shipping so much of our seafood abroad, which is a big part of why we have that deficit. And so we want to keep the seafood in the community, keep it local, keep it regional, keep it fresh. Now I do want to just, sort of highlight the elephant in the room. Christian kind of mentioned it earlier. There is a lot of political uncertainty. I'm based in the DC area, and every agency is being targeted in different ways, and NOAA is no exception to that. How that plays out, we have no idea, but it's just important to remember, like during these times, a lot of us have friends, colleagues, maybe even family members who work in the federal government in some capacity. So just, our hearts go out to everybody in this sort of, era of uncertainty, shall we say now. So just keep that in mind. And, Christian earlier mentioned some of the lawsuits that have been happening in this space. It was just, I think in one of the news flashes, you showed that Conservation Law Foundation, they're not a member of us, but they're a New England-based environmental organization. They just sued Cook Aquaculture last month for alleged Clean Water Act violations in their salmon farming up in the state of Maine. Also want to highlight, late last year, we actually won a lawsuit, Don't Cage Our Oceans versus U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. That was litigated by our DCO2 member, CLF. Sorry, there's too many acronyms here. Center for Food Safety, CFS. I had mentioned CLF earlier, so getting the acronyms all mixed up. But yeah, Center for Food Safety litigated that case on our behalf, along with several other plaintiffs. And what it did, and I'll bring this back to that executive order that Christian mentioned. So that 2020 executive order from Trump's first term did two things. So one of the things it did was order the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to issue what's known as a nationwide permit for finfish aquaculture. It was known as NWP 56. And this lawsuit that Center for Food Safety litigated ended up showing, and the holding was that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers violated 3 environmental laws in its effort to essentially assess the impacts, or rather issue this nationwide permit as a sort of blank check, so to speak, for allowing these fish farms to be in navigable waters without any question. It's a little more complicated than that, but it was a nice victory to show that really executive orders are not the way forward when we're talking about sound policy making in this space. Again, we would need an act of Congress if we were to ever think about doing this. However, as Christian highlighted earlier, we do not believe finfish farming is the answer. There's so many other better forms of aquaculture out there that should be promoted and researched further. So that lawsuit kind of was striking down one of those instructions, shall we say, from the executive order. The other part of that EO that is still live to this day, again, Biden never revoked it, are these aquaculture opportunity areas. And Christian was just talking about the AOAs in the Gulf of Mexico, where they're located. And the deadline, again, is February 20th to submit comments. And we'll be submitting comments as well, and be happy to share them with Christian and others on this call if they'd like to see those. And so that's really another area which is essentially, unfortunately, it's a de facto privatization of the ocean commons. So remember, when we're talking about our oceans, so beyond the 3-mile state line, we're talking about our publicly shared resources, right? All of us have the right to enjoy, recreate, go fishing, what have you, the tourism industry. We all have access to that ocean. But when we start cordoning off thousands and thousands of acres of space for private use of one company, that raises a lot of red flags for pretty much everybody who lives on the Gulf of Mexico, and even folks who don't even live by the water at all. The idea that one company is really exploiting, getting private profit out of the public commons. And essentially the ocean is used as their untreated sewage dumping area, which is just simply not right. We wouldn't allow for such things on land and land-based farming. There's at least mitigation measures in place. There's permits that they have to get for treating it before discharging, but unfortunately, that's not the way it is, and you're in the open ocean. And we've been told by industry over and over that the solution to pollution is dilution, which is ludicrous. Even in the 1800s, people were figuring out that wasn't right anymore. So it's kind of shocking to be hearing those talking points again. So I wanted to flag just one other thing, and I was hoping, Ral, you could drop this link in there, to not forget that the science is on our side. I know that Christian showed an infographic earlier, but we have, as of October 2024, there was a huge journal that came out, a huge piece on aquaculture from Science. So in Science Advances, and there, thanks for that link. Click on that, and there are about 10 different studies and syntheses of studies showing anything from the industry is over-exaggerating their fish in, fish out ratios, which mean it takes way too much fish to feed the farm fish, and you're actually losing fish in the process. So it's a ludicrous approach to raising seafood if you care about animal protein and a net gain of protein, because in the current method of feeding carnivorous finfish in the ocean, you're actually losing animal protein. And that animal protein is coming from other communities that are directly dependent on that. And I'm talking about people. So that's out of whack. And we see a lot of disease transfer from farm to wild stocks. There's some pieces on that in this issue. And then there's even some pieces from top marine scientists saying, look, we need to pause here. There needs to be a moral reckoning, and that's a direct quote, with doing this kind of fish farming at all. I mean, this is a very different beast from other forms of values-based aquaculture, or simply just fishing for that matter. So we need to really look at what's happening here, look at what it means to privatize spaces, to offload all your effluent and pollution to the community, and to really have these spaces for some cases 15, 20, and 25-year leases, which are human generations that we're talking about. We have fishermen on this call. They'll tell you, they'll be first. If any of them have been in the Gulf, they know that these net pens will not stay intact with the increasing intensity of hurricanes ripping through the Gulf. We've had so many in the last few years, it's hard to keep track of them all. And several folks, and I know there's folks on this call, have been personally affected by these storms. And it's really just, we're talking about fish escapes that already regularly happen every week. I mean, Christian was saying earlier, just even having like a basic following of the news, every week there's a fish escape somewhere, usually in Norway, Scotland, Iceland, Chile. And you would have 100% fish escapes with the next storm that rips through the Gulf. Just no questions there. So, I want to just stop there in the interest of time, but I do want to be here to answer any questions folks might have. I'm happy to go dive deep on anything policy, but I also want to make sure that people don't get too bored. It's not everybody's cup of tea. I understand policy. So I'll kick it back to you, Christian. Appreciate it.
Thanks, James. That was great as always. Appreciate the update and all of that. And I really appreciate that you talked about the issue of the commons, these shared resources of ours that we maybe need to talk more about, because the oceans are places we share, and it's it's up to us to decide how they want to be used. And do we want to see them exclusively used for profit by private companies, especially something that can potentially cause so much harm. So I think we do need to talk about that more. So I'm glad you brought it up. I was thinking about Dana and just thinking about, as our fisheries are changing into the future, taking that into account, whether that's, the potentially because of loss of habitat, we've had some fish have been harder to get, or climate change is affecting things. And I think about for restaurants and markets being able to maintain enough variety into the future. Do they feel like they're going to have to do people feel like, do chefs and people in your business feel like we need farm fish in order to meet the supply? Or what are they saying about that?
I feel like, it's really been over the past maybe 3 or 4 decades that that the seafood menu has become so focused on a kind of defined number of species, and being able to order those year round wherever you go, which obviously is not something that is sustainable. So my experience personally is over the past 5 years, I have a list that I created of species that I've used at Carmo or for other events and so forth, and it's over 70 different species from our local fishery. Um, and I have to say, out of all of those times that I used those fish, and many of them several times, not once did I have somebody say, that's just, I can't eat that, or it's crap, or there's a lot of potential in our underutilized species. There's a lot of potential actually in some of our more common species that are just used perhaps in ways that we could expand our minds. So I guess what I'm saying is that there's a lot of ways that we can introduce the public to new and actually exciting things. Towards the last few years, we were having people call every night, to find out what's on the menu for tonight, because that's not an experience they could get very many places. There are a handful of places in New Orleans that would source beyond, kind of the normal, 5 or 6 species that you see everywhere, most of which are farmed, sadly. So there's that. And then there's the other thing with regards to some of these industrial, fish farms, which is that it's the same mentality as big mono agriculture, facilities, which is lowest common denominator. It's what people want, right? So that's what we're going to produce. It's what people want. They want salmon. So we're going to produce a whole shitload of salmon to the exclusion of everything else. And that kind of mentality, obviously, not only is it really stupid and boring, it also doesn't give the public the benefit of the doubt that they actually are willing to try new things. And a lot of those things end up being better, tastier, more exciting, and certainly more sustainable, more cost-effective, fresher, all of those things. So, I mean, I kind of feel like we have a lot of opportunities to, really add something to the menu. And actually, one of the things too, with respect to mariculture, I'm working with one of our local oyster producers now and trying to figure out what species of ocean greens might be viable in our local fishery. And he's seeing some natural growth of a couple of viable species on some of his gear. And so that's what we're focusing on first. But right now at our new place, Nikkei, I have 7 different types of seafood I use on a daily, or seaweed that I use on a daily basis, most of which people don't even realize is part of the food. Some of it, I mean, we make a point, for example, one of the dishes that we do is it's 3 different types of seaweed presented as tempura. And like everybody has their favorite, but people come back, and if I don't have it on the menu, I hear about it. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things. There are over 3,000 types of sea or of ocean greens, at least, that are potentially edible. So, you know, we have a whole world out there of fish and, you know, greens and things to put on the menu. And let's start to think about eating, you know, kind of what's bountiful and what's available, you know. So yeah.
Yeah, I'm glad you talked about seaweed, because I've always wondered if we could ever have that from the Gulf, you know, being a warmer water area, but that would be really exciting if we ever had that.
There is one mariculture farm actually in Florida that's doing oysters, and I think they're doing uva lactuga, which is the sea lettuce. So
Very nice. We did have a question from Tiffany about any studies around commercial fish waste affecting water microbes. James answered a little bit about just the scale of these kind of farms and just the volume of waste that can come from them, because you know, a pound of feed does not become a pound of fish, and so there is a fair amount of waste in addition to the uneaten feed that can come from that. I don't know what, and Tiffany, we can follow up with you later if you wanted something more specific. I don't know as far as microbes. I mean, yes, there are, you know, the water is alive with microbial life, which can certainly be affected. I don't know the details of that. I mean, I think that obviously the fish waste is potentially a food for potentially more bacteria in the water is one thing. That's kind of what is part of the whole harmful algal blooms, dead zone kind of a thing. You know, when you get an algae bloom, the bacteria explode to break that down. And then as they die, they consume oxygen from the water. And that's, we would call those dead zones. We have a big one off the mouth of the Mississippi River each year. So nutrients from fish farms can certainly feed that type of algal, unnatural amount of algal growth that can lead to that. It's also possible that if any pharmaceutical products are used, you know, those are things that are designed to kill some type of a pathogen, right? Some type of disease that's affecting the fish. And so that can't stay just with the fish, right? This is an open water. So that's something also that could potentially affect microbial, you know, communities in the wild there. But I don't know a lot about that off the top of my head, but I'm certainly happy to follow up with you afterwards, and I'll put my email address. Well, actually, I'm going to follow up with everybody by email, everybody anyway, so you'll have my email because I'll follow up with some additional information on that action alert. And Tiffany, you're welcome to connect with me that way if I could get some more answers to you on that. James, I can't remember you. I know you. Oh, go ahead, James.
To chime in right there as you were talking, I remembered this would be for Tiffany and Christian, the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation. They've done a ton of work in this area on looking at nutrient overload and red tide and algal blooms. Christian, maybe later you can send the letter that they wrote in opposition to that Ocean Era project that you were talking about earlier. So I dropped a link to that organization. They've done some pretty good science in that area. That's all.
Yep, they've been strong advocates. Thank you. I guess, and I can't remember, James, when you talked about Domestic Seafood Production Act earlier, is that potentially will come back? We have a new Congress now. Bills from last time have to be reintroduced. Do we expect that might be reintroduced, or?
Well, we'd love to see it reintroduced. You know, this is a bill that came out in July of last year. We did have, so it was Congresswoman Peltola of Alaska, who was actually lost the election to Congressman Nick Begich, who's now the new at-large member for all of Alaska. But we were happy to see Representative Troy Carter on as a co-sponsor of that piece of legislation, in big part because of folks on this very call. So, is very, very persuaded by, these lived experiences of folks in his district. And we also had Congresswoman Suzanne Bonamici of Oregon join on that bill as well. So, we'd love to see it reintroduced and gain some more traction in this next Congress.
And for those who don't know, Troy Carter's represents the New Orleans area there. And he was nice enough to meet with us last year when I was up there with you. And that he was we were very warmly received by him. What about, would there potentially be any legislation to maybe bring some more order to the federal permitting system and all that stuff around offshore fish farms? Anything like that you think might happen?
Well, it's kind of unclear what's going to happen. I mean, so I'll talk about the executive order first. So, we're kind of back at where we started because it was Trump 1.0 that issued the executive order. So we'll see what Trump 2.0 does about it. Many folks, D and R, were telling me that Trump had no idea what the executive order was even about, that essentially his handlers just got that in for him. So I don't know how much awareness he has, or the new administration, how much they even care about it. But we'll find out on how, I guess, diligent they are and how spirited the agency is in pursuing, pushing forward this industry while there's still no authorization to do so via EO. Now, there is another effort pushed by industry known as the Aqua Act. It stands for the Advancing the Quality and Understanding of American Aquaculture. It is unfortunately a gift to the offshore finfish farming industry. It would basically give NOAA actual authority, so it would be an act of Congress that would give them the authority to start regulating and permitting fish farms in federal waters. And unfortunately, that would just essentially be open season for our whole exclusive economic zone. So right beyond your state waters, even if your state has made efforts to stop this in your own waters, you could see fish farms pop up at the 3.1 mile marker and beyond, really just beyond the state line. And there would be essentially nothing or little to nothing that you could do about it. And so that's always a bill that anytime that pops up, and if it gets reintroduced, we will let our members know that, that's something that none of us want to have a part of. And that's just really the exact opposite direction that we want to be going, kind of like what Dana was talking about earlier. Like that's the exact opposite way we want to go.
Well, I think we're right at about an hour, so we'll wrap up. Again, I will email everybody with the link again to the action alert around the aquaculture opportunity areas. You'll have my contact information, and I can certainly share contact information of anybody else if you need it, from James or potentially Dana as well. Dana, remind us, well, first of all, thank you, Dana, for giving the chef's perspective. That was amazing. And remind us the name of your new restaurant.
It's called Nikkei, Nikkei, Izakaya. So it's our partner in it is Wataru Saeki, who's a wonderful chef we've been working with for about 12 years. And it's cuisine of Japanese immigrant communities around the world. So there's a lot of interesting influences in izakaya form. So it's a pub, yeah, very funky pub.
Thanks. I can't wait to try it, and appreciate James. I see James and Raleigh had dropped the link in the chat, so hopefully everybody had a chance to check that out. And James, thanks to you again. I learned so much from you every time, and I appreciate you being up there in Washington and talking to our elected officials. And I'll be up there with you, in early March, and we'll be making the rounds again to try to talk to members of Congress and educate them on these issues. So look forward to joining you then. So with that, wish everybody a good night. Thank you all for joining us on this. This is this was great to have this attendance, and I appreciate all of you having interest in these issues. And I just ask you to talk to your friends, talk to the people in your community. A lot of the people in this call are in the Sarasota area. It's been very engaged with community associations and condo associations and community groups and city councils. Been very engaged on this issue because of your work, and so hopefully we'll continue to spread that around the Gulf Coast and hold the line on these fish farms. So thanks everybody, and wish you all a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.